Duck and cover, the NES has discovered the castle doctrine on NES Works episode 140. As the teaser for the end of last episode, I wrote, "Things are about to change," and honestly, I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. I must have written it in a fugue state, because the games this episode really feel like business as usual. Indeed, I've covered versions of both of these games for other platforms already. Castlequest here shipped in Japan under the title Castle Excellent for Famicom and MSX. But on SG-1000, it arrived under the very simple title of The Castle. This is almost, but not quite, that exact game. Think of Castlequest on NES as the puzzle adventure equivalent to Lode Runner on NES. It takes a computer game, which received a faithful port to SG-1000, and makes some technical and aesthetic changes to it. We can begin with the map of the castle, since that's really the defining feature of Castle Excellent and its variants. The computer version presented its world as a collection of 100 interconnected rooms, 10 single-screen chambers by 10. Castlequest also drops you into a 100-room realm, but the actual screen real estate it consumes is more like 13 by 10. That's because, again, going back to Lode Runner, each room now scrolls slightly rather than fitting onto a single screen. The rooms don't actually contain more elements than those on MSX or SG-1000, so far as I can tell. They're just decompressed, presumably as a result of the NES's strict 8x8 pixel tile system. This really hurts the game in my opinion, since it means you can't enter a room and immediately take in all the elements and opportunities ahead of you. Castlequest gives you a comical 50 lives from the outset. It's basically the designers apologizing in advance. And well they should. While Castlequest's programmers were tweaking the rooms to be harder to navigate, they could have taken the time to refine the controls, or just make collision detection and combat less finicky. But no, although Castlequest on NES moves more smoothly than on other hardware, because how could it not, your little sprite guy is still puttering around at about half the frame rate of a Mario or Mega Man. I kind of feel like the difficulty may be the point though. Once you begin comparing Castlequest to its earlier iterations, you start to realize that a huge number of rooms throughout the castle have been redesigned, moved around, or otherwise rearranged. These changes make the game neither easier nor more difficult to play. But they work to make this a remix, the way the original Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 was designed to mess with kids who had committed the original Super Mario to muscle memory. The new revisions here would certainly have thrown seasoned fans who knew Castle Excellent inside and out for a loop. Not that any such creature existed in America in 1989. Honestly, it's hard to imagine anyone, anywhere, in 1989 wanting to play this game. Like Hyde lied, it feels painfully dated as a fairly faithful console port arriving 3 or 4 years after its computer debut. Without the familiarity of an existing legacy to fall back on here in America, the way it could in Japan, Castlequest just feels unfriendly and primitive compared to, say, Legacy of the Wizard. I mean, I'm pretty sure Castle Excellent was a key inspiration for Legacy of the Wizard. The interconnected dungeon, the puzzle-like nature of interlocking rooms and keys, the floating jumps, the environmental hazards. But if that's so, Legacy of the Wizard massively improved on ASCII's creation. And then it had the audacity to ship months before Castlequest here in the US. Of course, back in the NES days, none of that necessarily factored in. When you went game shopping, you just kinda had to guess at what you were buying. Take a shot and hope for the best based on cover art, screenshots, and Nintendo Power coverage. And Castlequest's cover at least looks pretty great. As for the Nintendo Power coverage, well, Nintendo Power didn't have much to say about Castlequest. The game got a dinky little half-page preview in the September-October 1989 issue that gave it some of the most pitiful power meter ratings of any game in the magazine's history. So low it's a wonder that Howard Phillips gave the cartridge concept approval in the first place. And the same goes for our other game this episode, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Needless to say, Castlequest works the same as the castle. You control a little guy moving through a castle, collecting keys in search for, what else? A kidnapped princess, which you can only do by locating a pair of fairies somewhere in the castle depths. Again, shades of Hyde lied. Keys only work on doors of the same color. There are 6 colors of keys and 6 colors of doors, and each key only works once. So needless to say, this game largely consists of trying to collect keys and then figuring out which door to stick them in. You do have a degree of freedom in where you go, which is actually more intimidating than liberating. Here's a room with 3 yellow doors, but you only have 1 yellow key. Which is the best door to take? You can pretty easily get yourself stuck in what appears to be a soft lock if you go the wrong way, though you can't really know which way will be best until you've made that mistake. Your dopey little prince guy doesn't grow in powers or skills as he moves through the castle, so your only defense against the roaming monsters in each room is to drop a block on them, not available in all regions, or to stab them with your pathetic little 1-pixel sword. You know, like in Hide Lied. The controls and timing of everything in Castlequest feel awful compared to other NES games of this era. But for some reason, something about Castlequest still manages to be weirdly compelling. I don't like this game, but I could see myself becoming hooked on it if I had played it back in the day. It's the kind of adventure that gets under your skin, and you hate yourself for it, but you can't stop playing. For some people, that might even represent some twisted version of fun. On the less opaque and archaic front, we have another journey through a massive castle. Thankfully, this one is more linear, more responsive, and stars a beloved cartoon character. It's the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle. Yes, it's the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle. You may remember this one from the very early days of Game Boy Works, or Game Boy World, 10 years ago. Or more likely, you remember it from the Angry Video Game Nerd, whose coverage of the series has been seen by about 8 million more people than mine. Whatever the case, you surely know the drill here. You play as Bugs Bunny.
What's up, Doc?
Little cartoon rabbit created as a one-off riff on a character from a movie made 90 years ago who somehow stuck around to become the primary mascot and money-making character for the Warner Brothers Corporation. Or at least that was true in the late 1980s. You don't see as much of Bugs in the gang these days, but 30 to 40 years ago, his cartoons ran in weekly rerun blocks. His face was plastered across merchandise. He starred in a movie with Michael Jordan, and he even got recruited by Six Flags to work as a park mascot as counter-programming against Mickey Mouse and Disneyland. But the late 1980s were a time of détente and normalization of adversarial relations. And that includes not only the US and the Soviet Union, but also the Bugs and Mickey relationship. The Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle arrived hot on the heels of Bugs and Mickey sharing equal time in their Who Framed Roger Rabbit cameos. The lads put aside their differences just long enough to attempt to murder Detective Eddie Valiant with a defective parachute. And, curiously enough, that makes the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle a licensing Bermuda Triangle that manages to suck in all of those things. A video game Sargasso, a black hole of branding. As you probably know, the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle began life on Famicom Disk System as Roger Rabbit. Then Kemco reworked Roger into Bugs, and the Weasels into Sylvester and Company, but kept the gameplay and visuals otherwise unchanged. Then, when the game shipped for Game Boy, it remained Bugs Bunny in the US, but in Japan it became Mickey Mouse. Therefore, we can safely conclude that Who Framed Roger Rabbit was the nexus of all reality, and that humanity peaked with the movie. My sympathies to the millennials and zoomers who arrived too late to experience it firsthand. It's been a literal decade since my Game Boy Crazy Castle video, so I feel like a refresher on the weirdness of this game franchise's history is in order. Kemco really saw this series as a one-size-fits-all placeholder for whichever license it happened to hold in a given territory at the time, which certainly speaks to the generic puzzle action nature of the game. Here on NES, Crazy Castle wore 3 different licenses depending on the region and platform. That would also be the case for the sequel, which shipped here as Bugs Bunny, but in Japan and some parts of Europe as Mickey Mouse. But other parts of Europe received it as a belated reissue attached to a horrifying Scandinavian television property called Hugo. The third Crazy Castle maintained the Mickey Mouse license in Japan, but Kemco evidently didn't lock down either Disney or Warner for the US. So they just invented a wretched new character called Kid Clown and published that third Crazy Castle as Kid Clown in Nightmare World, which should have been the end of this tragic ordeal right then and there. But no, the strength of Mickey's appeal in Japan, where the Disney Store had opened its first outlet around the time that Mickey Mouse 3 landed on Famicom, kept this nonsense going. So in 1993, the fourth Crazy Castle arrived on Game Boy, carrying forward the Mickey brand in Japan, but inflicted with B-tier losers everywhere else. Europeans were given a Garfield skin re-release, while Americans had to settle for a tie-in with the real Ghostbusters cartoon, which had ceased production a few years earlier, meaning that the licensing rights must have been super cheap for Kemco. And finally, the fifth entry in the Crazy Castle series managed to bring all regions into alignment at long last. It shipped as Mickey Mouse Magic Wands in all territory, including the US. This should have been the end of the story, Kemco's quixotic quest to give the whole world a Mickey Mouse game complete, but no, it merely reset the clock. In 1997, Kemco published a sixth title in Japan for the original Game Boy, lacking any sort of license at all, called Sorayuke Kid. The kid in question is simply Japan's less ghoulish take on Kid Clown, who had starred in a few 16 and 32-bit action games in the interim under that name. You have to assume that between starring a zero of a protagonist and showing up as a monochromatic Game Boy release in 1997, which didn't involve capturing adorable battle critters, Sorayuke Kid almost certainly sold like crap. Kids in 1997 only wanted Pokemon for their Game Boy, and the character Sorayuke Kid gave off the energy of a low-tier NPC dork who built a trio of trash Pokemon as a gimme win in an early route. But that's okay because Kemco hacked color into his game a couple of years later to become Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3. Now, this was not a port of the third Crazy Castle game, which was released here as Kid Clown, but in fact a color version of the recent Game Boy release that took advantage of the fact that there had technically never been a game that shipped under the name Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3 back in the day. I believe the marketing angle here was, hey kids, remember that Bugs Bunny game your parents bought you 10 years ago, and it wasn't very fun, but it was the only game you had besides Taboo, so you forced yourself to enjoy it in a state of Stockholm Syndrome? Well, here's another one of those. In my opinion, not the most compelling pitch. But somehow it worked well enough that Kemco cranked out Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 4 for Game Boy Color a year later. At this point, Kemco lost the Bugs Bunny license again. So when Crazy Castle 5 shipped 2 years later for Game Boy Advance, they were reduced to using the Woody Woodpecker license for the game. Shockingly, it turns out that this release was the tie-in for a concurrent run of a brand new Woody Woodpecker series on Fox Kids, meaning that Woody Woodpecker was somehow the freshest and most up-to-date of all the licenses Crazy Castle had worn since Roger Rabbit. What wasn't fresh and up-to-date, however, was the gameplay. With its zoomed-in view, mismatched graphics, and stale premise, I can't imagine that anything about Crazy Castle 5 had any appeal whatsoever for a generation that had come to expect sprawling Super NES and Genesis caliber action and adventure experiences on their portable systems. GBA didn't have to slum it like this, and Kemco finally got the message. After 9 largely identical games wearing the flesh of no less than 9 different lead characters in the space of 13 unlucky years, they finally put Crazy Castle to rest. Best of all, very few of those games have ever resurfaced on platforms like Virtual Console because, outside of Kid Clown and his doppelganger Sorayuke Kid, all of these games have worn the likenesses of media properties that would almost certainly be too pricey for modern-day Kemco to afford to renew on their pocket-lint budget. But I come here today to praise this proverbial Caesar, not to bury it. The Crazy Castle franchise had a long, unhappy, and frankly cynical existence. But the original game is actually not too shabby for its time and place. I mean, yes, you can clearly see how this was meant to be a Roger Rabbit game. Kemco didn't bother to reprogram a lot of the graphical details, so you end up with monochromatic antagonists who notably wear the same color palettes as Roger Rabbit's weasels. And while Bugs collects carrots, which you'll find to be wholly on brand, he's not really a character you associate with dropping safes on others' heads. Anvils maybe, but safes are more a Tom and Jerry thing. He's also not much of a spring-loaded boxing glove kind of character either. A welterweight boxer from time to time, sure, but these were meant to be Marvin Acme gimmicks, and that's more of a Wile E. Coyote association. But look beyond the serial numbers that have been so poorly filed away, and you'll find a perfectly decent puzzle platform action game in the mold of early Famicom titles, nay, microcomputer classics, like Nuts and Milk and Door Door. You can see why the Crazy Castle series thrived on Game Boy, because Game Boy became the eventual haven for games like this. Bugs needs to make his way through 6 levels in which he collects carrots while evading his various adversaries. Bugs can climb Castlevania-style stairs to reach different elevations, as well as duck into doors, which also contains stairs that allow him to reach different elevations. So can the bad guys, though. They have the same mobility options as bugs, including the use of doorways, meaning that they can box you in if you let them surround you. You can fight back to a limited degree by taking out your foes. You can drop crates and safes on characters below you, or launch one of those spring-loaded boxing gloves laterally to take out a pursuer up close. Smashing or clobbering an enemy removes them from the action for the remainder of the stage, but you only have as many weapons as you can find scattered around a level. As you advance further into the game, the number of enemies you need to deal with begins to outnumber the tools you'll be able to utilize to take them out. So you can't entirely rely on offense as your best defense. Bugs, despite being a damn rabbit, can't actually jump, only fall from a higher ledge to the ground below, and that further limits your escape options in a pinch. The stages grow larger and more convoluted over the course of the game, and they alternate between vertical and horizontal scrolling, but they don't ever really change. You always need to collect the same carrots while avoiding or destroying the same dudes with the same weapons. It's a completely tolerable little puzzle game, and it certainly feels a lot nicer to play than Castlequest. But the general sense of repetition and monotony and sameness and lack of change and general sense of repetition sap it of all long-term appeal. At least Castlequest has weirdness and the curiosity of exploration going for it, as well as a protagonist that can jump despite not being a rabbit, even if it feels about as fun to play as dropping an anvil on your foot. Next time on NES Works, what's a bunch of castles without a king, or a knight, or a caveman?